So this is our second to last session here. I'm excited to have Ben Chu from the Botanical Gardens here talking about pruning. So hopefully you got a chance to read over Ben's bio, but he's been with the Botanical Garden since 1982, been the supervisor of the Japanese garden since 1985, and he is the chief arborist of the Botanical Gardens. I'm not sure if I got that title exactly right, but basically, if you've been to the Botanical Gardens, which hopefully you all have, you've seen some of Ben's work and some of the work he's instructed other people to do. So definitely knows this topic very well. And I'll let Ben take it from here.
All right, great. Thank you, Mark. I hope everyone can hear me. It does say Janice Nesser. That's my alias tonight. That's actually I'm on my wife's setup in her office, so it's a little bit more mega than mine. So I thought I'd give it a shot. Um, Mark already gave you my background at the Botanical Garden, so appreciate that. Thanks, Mark. I am a member of the International Society of Arboriculture, and through ISA, International Society of Arboriculture, I'm a certified arborist, as are most of our arborists at the Botanical Garden. Certified arborist means that I took the time to study 11 or so chapters, domains at the time. I took it a long time ago. And it goes through plant health, climbing, rigging, knots, fertilization, the whole host of data information that is relevant to arboriculture and tree care. So, and through ISA, I was able to become certified arborist, take a test, and every 3 years I have to remain current in the field by gaining 30 continuing education units in order to maintain my status as a certified arborist. So when you speak to people that talk about certified arborists and what's good about a certified arborist is I think that they bring to the table a lot of the most recent information technology, and they're passionate about staying current with the world of arboriculture. So it's always a good place to start whenever you're looking to get information and or maybe a contract with a contractor to do some work. So good place to start. This is a fairly long presentation. I've been doing pruning presentations for probably well over 30 years now to master gardeners, adult education, various groups throughout St. Louis. So it's a topic that I'm really passionate about, and I hope to be able to share that with all of you and to any of you who might be a little bit new to pruning or maybe have some trepidations about pruning. Hopefully, after going through this and referring to the outline in the future, you'll become a little bit more comfortable with the pruning process and also be able to master whatever it is that you're trying to do through the pruning that you are doing. So I'm going to actually take my video off when I start this presentation, so I'm not looking at myself all the while. So I'm going to go ahead and start this slideshow. All right, I'm gonna go over to this other screen. You won't see me very much on here at all. So hang on just a second.
3 people, not computer people, so bear with us.
Yeah. There we go. I'm gonna turn that off right now, and I'm gonna go over here. Everybody's good now. So usually when I start my presentation, I always kind of lay out the objectives that hopefully you'll gain from this presentation. So the first thing that I like to do is I like to define what pruning is, and get a little bit of understanding of why we prune and what are the benefits of pruning. Learn about proper tool use, and once we've learned about proper tools and how to use them, then we'll talk about the pruning process. So the first thing is the definition of pruning. The pruning is the removal of part of a plant for the benefit of all the plant. So that means that you're taking off not just material that might be dead, or um, it's not just restricted to parts of the plant that are dead. They're going to be parts of the plant that are still green and alive, and you may have a little bit of reservation about removing that, but you shouldn't have any worries. um, I used to prune roses for my next door neighbor some years ago when I lived in the city, and she always wanted to go back in the house when I was pruning her roses. And I thought, well, why is she doing that? Um, Going back into the house to when I come over to prune, I thought, well, maybe she's going in to maybe uh, make a cake or make me some cookies or something like that. Well, it never ended up being the case. And finally, I had to ask her. I said, "Why do you always go back in the house when I come over to prune your roses?" And she said, "Well, I just can't bear the sight of you cutting off green branches." I guess that she felt that perhaps that was something that would pruning off those branches would actually kill our roses and prevent them from blooming, which was never the case. So I could never convince her to stay outside to watch me prune, or to actually take part in the pruning herself. So part of the pruning is the removal of part of the plant for the benefit of all the plant. Um, to cut off or to cut back parts of for better shape or more fruitful growth, and to remove as superfluous. And that'll really be a little bit more apparent as I talk a little bit about um, aesthetic pruning and later on. Um, One of the benefits of uh, pruning is that it improves plant health. Normally, when you think about improving plant health, you think about watering, you think about fertilization, you think about pest control, things like that, as far as improving plant health. But pruning can also benefit a plant's health through removal of diseased parts. One of the things that you will see as a recommendation if you have a plant that may have a diseased part, or maybe a minor insect infestation. One of the recommendations is just to remove that part to a healthy part, so as to avoid and prevent any spreading of the disease in the plant. Removal of broken branches. This is health related in that if you were to allow these broken branches to remain on the tree, and they were to eventually get pulled off, or they were to get torn off, it would create a bad tear, and also that tear would have a difficult time in developing a callus and wound wood, and actually trying to close itself off from the outside. So removal of broken branches does help in as far as the overall health of the tree, and that it was allowed to um, uh, callus over, close off a wound that was created by a broken branch. Um, you can health of the plant is also benefit by being able to maintain an open crown of the plants that you have growing in your landscape. Open crowns will allow for good light penetration to the interior of the plant, which will allow the plant the opportunity to develop new material growing on the interior for future use if you need to prune back aggressively, or to open it up to get more light inside. Um, Maintaining an open crown also gives you the the opportunity for air to pass through the crown. Also, good air circulation is important for the control of some diseases, and also to control some insect infestation. So maintaining an open crown can be important in those two ways, allowing good light penetration and also by allowing good air circulation through the plant. One other benefit of maintaining an open crown is that if you do have any sort of infestation, you're able to have adequate control by being able to spray to the interior of the plant. Oftentimes, if your plant is too dense, you're unable to control any insects or diseases that might be harbored on the interior of the plant. But by maintaining an open plant, an open crown, you're able to get good spray penetration if necessary. The another benefit of pruning is that you can use the pruning to direct and encourage plant growth in the landscape. Many times you will have in your landscape a tree that has a branch that might be interfering with the use of the area immediately underneath it and around it, whether it be recreational or whether it's just through or whether it's maintenance of the landscape. You can help mitigate that problem by pruning branches that are hanging downward to a more upward growing branch, or you can prune to. I'm trying to see if I can. I can't find it right now. I was looking for the pointer, but you can prune to buds that are growing in an upward position. That way, as they continue to develop and grow, they're going to be moved into an upper plane where it's not interfering with any of the uses that might be made either underneath it or around that tree. You can correct lopsidedness in trees. Oftentimes you may have trees that are growing too close to each other, or one tree may be a little bit more aggressive than the other, causing the lesser, weaker tree to grow out and away from the larger tree, trying to gain space and also to gain sunlight. And for some reason, during the life of these two trees, the larger tree is removed, or some pruning is done to mitigate and alleviate the pressure it's causing on the neighboring tree. Once that happens, the other tree can be pruned to give it to rebalance the tree, correct the lopsidedness of the tree so that it appears more upright and more symmetrical. You won't ever be able to take out the bow, the bend in the trunk, but you can prune judiciously some of the branches in order to give it a little bit more of a balanced shape, a little bit more symmetrical shape. Pruning to fill gaps in shrubbery. This is important if you have something that may happen to a plant, something catastrophic that happens to a plant in your landscape, or you have something that falls on it. You know, might get an ice dam that breaks apart off the roof and lands on your shrubbery, on your hedges at the base of your house, or in my case, a 97-pound German Shepherd Lab mix jumps out a second-story window and lands on your hedge below, creating a little bit of a gap and breaking his fall, luckily. But this is a way that if you do experience something where a void is created in the shrub, you can prune to branches and or buds that are pointed in the direction of the gap. And over a period of time, maybe 2 years, 3 years, it might be possible to actually conceal that gap, close that gap off with new stems and new foliage. You can encourage lateral buds through the act of pruning. This is illustrating an example of when you might go and purchase a package of these sticks in a bundle, and through the magic of graphics, it's advertised itself as a wonderful backdrop, a great hedge, a great barrier between you and a unwanted vista or view. Um, and you might think to yourself, well, when is that would happen with with this bundle of sticks? I think that in this situation, once you've planted those sticks in a row, and you've determined that they've truly established themselves, you can go in there and prune back, tip prune these each of these stems, each of these little seedling saplings that you planted. Prune back a one cut to make a at the terminal, which will encourage the stem to develop side buds, which in turn will develop into stems. And the following year, you can prune those to a bud, and that will help to increase the density of that plant in a shorter period of time. So when you look at this illustration, what you're looking at is probably a 2 to 3 year process, and as far as being able to expand um, um, the density of the shrubs over a shorter period of time. I mean, this would probably happen regardless, but you can. This is just a way to um, uh, enhance the process, make it go a little bit faster. Another benefit of pruning is to increase production, either be it flowering and or in fruiting. In flower production, you can see in this illustration where the process of just removing the spent blooms from the um, uh, from this rhododendron will encourage the buds that are at the base of the flower at the terminal. You encourage those to develop. So what happens is after you've removed um, the spent blooms, these two axillary buds will develop, become stems, and develop new terminals. What you can do is after those have gone through about half of their growth process for the season, you can pinch them again, and that in turn will encourage the axillary buds in the leaves to develop. So just through that one pruning process or pruning action of removing the spent bloom, you're actually being able to quadruple the number of terminals that you'll have on this rhododendron, which is where the flower buds are going to develop for the following year. So just through that process, you're able to quadruple the number of terminals that you have and quadruple the number of flowers that you're produced in the following season. In flower production, in growing roses, or in the case of like our single stem chrysanthemums in our Japanese garden, this is a process that we do to help encourage the size of the bloom, and also to increase its sometimes the intensity of the coloration. And what this is disbudding to improve flower size. So the side buds, these axillary buds, flower buds that are being developed on this in this illustration, the rose, whatever nutrients and energies would have gone into uh, those axillary flower buds is actually going into the main flower bud, giving it a much bigger, larger, colorful rose for the future. Pruning to improve fruit production. If you're growing fruit at your home, this is a way that you can improve fruit production by keeping the crowns open, allowing sunlight to penetrate, developing a good structure. Many fruit trees have uh, a, a best pruning structure in which they will develop their at their best. So like apple trees will often, you can grow apple trees with a central leader. Other methods of growing allows for an open, more vase shape. Peach trees will grow better in a more open vase shape. So it's specific to the type of fruit that you're growing. Most times when you um, search for information regarding fruit production in the home garden, it'll probably tell you the best pruning shape in which to develop individual and specific fruit trees. Fruit trees can be pruned to be aesthetic as well as productive. Oftentimes, if you were to look at trees that are pruned in orchards, it's pretty aggressive, it's pretty rough, and I think that you have to consider that the work that they're doing as orchardists is really much more about agriculture. It's about crop production, so it's a little bit more aggressive and not as much to the aesthetic side as what you can achieve in your home landscape. If you do prune well in your orchard and your fruit trees, you may get a bumper crop of fruit at some point in time. And what might be important to do is to thin out that fruit in order to uh, allow the plant to develop larger fruit and a little bit sweeter fruit. So it's a little bit of a trade-off. You know, it all depends on what your priorities are. If you do have a lot of fruit that might be developed on your tree, you may be more inclined to say, "I like lots of fruit, but I don't mind them being smaller." They may not be as sweet as the larger fruit, but that's okay. Or you could go the other direction and say, well, I'd much rather have fewer fruit but larger fruit. So I'll go in there and thin out some of the smaller fruits, maybe some of the fruits that might be blemished or underdeveloped, and remove those, hand pick those, and allow those remaining fruits to take advantage of the additional nutrients to help them develop and grow and sweeten. Finally, one of the towards the end of some of the benefits for pruning is to for size control. Pruning is most often, I think that when people think about pruning, pruning is size control is really high on their list of why they would want to prune something. But for me, it's a little bit lower on the list because I think that the size control really starts with right plant, right place, and also understanding what the end goal is for that plant in the landscape. How much space there you're going to allow them to grow, and I think those are the considerations that one makes as the plant grows to prune while it's growing, rather than to wait until the plant has gotten beyond its limits and then decide to prune it. In this case, the pruning that's taking place is meant to uh, reduce the competition between use of sidewalk and the shrub in that island bed. Also, to reduce and eliminate the conflict of space between the drive and that shrub. It's a lilac. It's actually a lilac. So this pruning is done to reduce that competition so that vehicles aren't interfering or running into the plant as they're using the driveway. But pruning is size control really is something that is considered when the plant's going in the ground, and doing it while the plant is actively growing and maintaining that space rather than waiting until it's gotten too large. Here's that island bed of lilac. You can see the sidewalk use is unobstructed. Driveway use, you can see the actual curb, and vehicles able to use this. The vehicular use, pedestrian use are all able to be achieved without conflict from the plant that's in that island bed. Size control is pretty important in this particular landscape. This is the Japanese garden. I talk a little bit. I'll reference Japanese garden because I'll use it as a good example of aesthetic pruning. I talk a little bit more about the pruning process. But in size control, this is a very important in a Japanese garden because we have to be sure that the stones are not obscured from view by shrubs overgrowing them. Stones are considered the backbone of the landscape in the Japanese garden, and it's important that the stones be apparent and viewable. So it's not so much about the plants in the Japanese garden. It's really much more about the stones and what the plants do to help accent them or frame them. In the Japanese garden, it's the responsibility of the horticulturist to prune these particular plants. These are actually boxwoods and junipers that are flanking the stone and also in front of that stone. So it's important that the horticulturists prune these shrubs on an annual basis. We can't go a year without pruning these plants uh, without having the stones become obscured and not viewable in the landscape. So it's important that we prune these on an annual basis. If you do, hopefully all of you've had opportunity to really kind of walk around in the Japanese garden and take a look at the pruning and the shrubs that we have that are part of the landscape. The shrubs that you see, these are all pruned by hand. We don't shear very much in the Japanese garden. I think that philosophically, it will help the plants remain. It increases their longevity, and it maintains them in a very healthy state in the landscape by hand pruning them and allowing for that open canopy, that open crown, the open crown to allow for good light and good air to penetrate um, the um, uh, the crown. Pruning to enhance ornamental value. So pruning can um, bring out the best in plant material, like this tree house. This is my I'm working on this for my retirement, so it'll be done by the time I retire. But every tree has its own form, its own structure, its own habit. It's up to us when we prune to help actually bring that out, to enhance that, to accentuate that in the plant. I think that is an important pruning process, not just in the Japanese garden. This is actually a weeping crabapple in the Japanese garden, but in any landscape that you have around your home or are able to maintain. If you prune to bring out that form, that structure, to actually enhance and accentuate the skeleton, the bones of that plant, brings out the essence of that plant. I think you'll be able to enjoy that plant even in the dead of winter. I think that's sort of an underviewed, underappreciated time of the year to view the landscape because people aren't paying attention to the structure of the plant when they're pruning them. But I think that if you do, you're going to bring out and be able to make that part of that characteristic of that tree much more apparent and much more appreciated in the winter landscape. So you're making your landscape more of a all seasons sort of landscape where it can be appreciated regardless of the season, and especially during the winter time.
Hey Ben, can we take care of a couple questions real quick?
Sure.
So one is that debudding technique for that you described for roses, is that appropriate for all types of roses?
Um, I don't know if you could do that to all types of roses, especially like multifloras, but I would imagine like some of the certainly the hybrid teas are it's appropriate. You can do that to the hybrid teas. Mm, yeah, the old fashions maybe. So I don't know. It's really sort of experimental. If you want to try it, I would certainly encourage it.
And then another one, this one's pretty tricky, but any tips to keep pests like squirrels from taking all the fruit off of a fruit tree? Yeah, I know
uh,
that's a
uh,
if you could answer
that
that,
kind of
you'd
that
probably retire right
borders
now.
on violence, but no. Yeah, that's a difficult question. I think that's an age-old question that people are always trying to answer. And people say you can net them, but if you're not good at netting, there's squirrels can find a void, they can chew a void, they can it's hard to do that. hanging aluminum cans or pie pans and human hair, Irish Spring soap. I mean, there's all sorts of methods out there that people say work, but I don't know of one that's foolproof at all.
Yeah. So a couple more here. As far as using when you hand prune, the question is, do you only use a pruning tool or can you also use pruning shears? So I don't know if they're asking specifically about like power shears or like
Oh,
hand shears.
yeah. When we do shear, we're usually doing it with hand shears because we're not really taking off a lot. We're really just shearing through, like on junipers. In the case of junipers, we'll prune off the heavier growth, and then we're taking off maybe 3/4 of an inch to an inch to just tighten the forms to make it look a little bit smoother and geometric and symmetrical in the Japanese garden landscape.
Yeah, it's really easy to go overboard with the power shears. And then just one more, I think, just inspired by this slide here. But what's the best time of the year to prune magnolias?
Um, Personally, I like to prune magnolias in the wintertime because you can see the structure really well. I think that um, I I'm a I have a tendency to prune um, in the wintertime and disregard blooming if I have to for a season. Like if I need to prune something aggressively or I need to do some restructuring like on a magnolia, I'll prune it with and sacrifice the blooms for a season in order to have ease of sight and vision for the pruning of the of magnolia. So I advocate pruning in the wintertime because it's just so much easier to see the structure. And then in the summertime, if you do need to do any kind of pruning, it'll probably be water sprouts or root suckers or whatever. So it's just easier to see it.
All right, I think that's it for now. Thanks.
All right, no problem. So anyway, I think this benefit we were talking about here was talking about uh, mm, benefit of enhancing ornamental value. And this uh, slide, what I'm showing here is a magnolia Salongiana, a saucer magnolia in the Japanese garden, and you can see the how it's so open and that there's good spacing around each of the blooms. Well, that's intentional. What we're doing is we're trying to allow adequate space around each of the flower buds so that when they do open, they open to their fullest. They open fully and they maximize the space and their beauty in the landscape. Just a note about this tree, it is a Magnolia Salongiana. Normally a tree this old, this tree is probably from the hmm, it's probably over 30 years old right now, probably closer to 35 years old. And a tree, a Magnolia Salongiana at that age would typically be about 30 feet tall and about 40 feet wide, maybe. This tree at 35 years old is only about 4 feet tall, 4.5 feet tall, and about 6 feet wide. So this is all achieved through the ability of the horticulturist pruning this tree to prune to interior growth, allowing new growth to come out on a continual basis, and doing that on an annual basis. So you can do a lot through pruning if you're just practice. Or another ornamental value you might find and use in the landscape is topiary. Um, a lot of work. You got to start when the plants are young, and you got to keep at it in order to maintain it. This gentleman here is renowned for his topiary, Pearl Friar. He's lives in Bishopville, South Carolina, and he has somewhere around 3.5, 4 acres in South Carolina that is all topiary. He takes a lot of the plants that he has growing in his garden, are cast off. He probably has about, I think he says he's somewhere around 400 um, uh, shrubs in his 400 topiaries in his garden, and these are all cast off. These are all plants that were thrown out by nurseries that he took, and and he planted in his garden and babied and pruned over a period of time. But he takes topiary to the fine art. This is actually three of his topiaries, and this is at Lone Meyer Sculpture Park here in St. Louis. So this is pruning, uh, taking it to the fine art sculpture. Um, here's a type of pruning that one could consider ornamental type of pruning. This is called espalier. Espalier began as a utilitarian practice of trying to maximize the space given to grow fruits and vegetables. This dates back to um, early years, early like 1500s, maybe earlier 1300s in France, where residents were given a parcel of land, and they had to maximize that to grow to grow enough food to feed themselves and their families. So this began as a utilitarian practice and has kind of morphed into more aesthetic type pruning in some situations. I'll show you some slides of that in a minute. This is an espalier nursery, or excuse me, an orchard in outside of Portland, Oregon. There's a wine country, a wine district outside of Portland, Oregon, and we were driving down this road to go to some wineries there, and I just saw acres and acres of vineyards, and I was thinking that, oh, maybe these are vineyards too, or these were grapes as well. But as we were speeding by, I noticed on the ground, if you can see just beyond the pickets of the fence, there are all these apples that are laying on the ground, and sort of mid central part of that slide, there's a tree that's just loaded with apples as well. So this is an orchard that is using an espalier technique in order to grow their apple trees and maximize the space that they have. So the space that they're taking up with two rows of espaliers may have been only enough space for one large fruit tree to grow, full-bodied fruit tree. So they're able to maximize the space in which they're allowed to grow these fruit trees. It's probably a U-pick operation. So what it also does is that it is gives the consumer the opportunity to pick from both sides of the plant, whether it's from facing it or reaching through and picking from the other side. And also, if there's any need for any pest control required, you can do so easily without having to overspray to protect. So this is still good use of espalier uh, uh, currently still in use. Here's a espalier at Chicago Botanic Garden. This is a espalier crabapple. It's the very large wall that they're covering with this crabapple, pretty long. It's only just a small part of it. Here's a espalier. This is in Portland, Oregon. This is a pyracantha. This is a wall just below their rose garden, which is just below the Japanese garden in Portland, Oregon. But this is a espalier pyracantha. So there's a lot of different types of styles of espalier. It all depends on how much effort you want to put into growing and training this. Espalier usually to give the best effect, you're going to have to prune them probably 2 to 3 times a year in order to maintain the form adequately. So those are all the reasons that we prune. Hopefully one of those is important, will be a good reason for why all of you are pruning. Now to talk a little bit about the pruning types that we will have. There's only really 3 pruning types that will be used to describe pruning at all. If you're talking about pruning, describing pruning, or you're asking questions about it, or you're trying to engage with an arborist to do some work for you, these are the types of cuts that you and that arborist will use. We'll talk about whenever you're describing the work that you want to have done. A first type of pruning that we have is called drop crotch pruning. Drop crotch pruning is the removal of a terminal to a lateral. Okay, so that is by taking a terminal to lateral, that's really a reduction cut. So this is a type of cut that will be used to reduce the height and reduce the size of a plant. So if you're doing reduction cutting, or you're interested in reducing a plant, this is the type of cut that you're going to use. This is a drop crotch cut. If you want to thin the density of the canopy, you're going to use what's called a thinning cut. Thinning cut is taking a lateral and removing it to its point of origin. Okay, this is going to be useful for, you're going to use thinning cuts to remove crossing branches, competing branches, thinning out the density of the canopy, and opening up, developing the form of a plant. So you're going to be using thinning cuts. These are typically a little bit more intermediate size cuts. Oh, let me go back one, sorry. Heading back, another type of cutting. Pruning, this is actually a type of pruning that is done indiscriminately along the stem. So this is the heading back is something that'll happen when you're shearing plant material for either formal gardens, or if you're doing topiary. These are the types of cuts that you'll create through that process. It's called heading cut. So it's indiscriminate along the stems. So in small plants and shrubs, this is probably important pruning type. But when you start to talk about getting into large trees, this is a detrimental type of pruning, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a couple more slides ahead. I just wanted to show this slide. This is actually a mugo pine that has been reduced and thinned using drop crotch and thinning cuts. So you can see that the plant is very open, very thin. So we're maintaining an open crown to get that good light and a good air circulation through the crown. You may think that this is a little bit aggressive because you can see daylight on the other side. You see sky on the other side. But this is actually during the spring. If you look at the background trees, you can see they're still bare. They haven't leafed out yet. So this is during the springtime. When this plant does begin to grow, this mugo pine begins to grow, we know that the candles are going to elongate, and the needles are going to expand and lengthen. And we know how much this plant will bear as far as openness, so that when it does leaf out, when the candles do elongate and the needles emerge, we know that the canopy will look complete. It'll look full. You won't see that sky through the background. So you can achieve good open crowns, reducing cuts, drop crotch cuts, and thinning cuts in order to reduce density. Let's talk a little bit about heading back, heading cuts. As I said, this is a type of pruning where you're cutting back indiscriminately, either cutting to a stub, or maybe a lateral that's too small, or even to a bud is considered heading back. What this does in large trees and mature trees that so detrimental to is it stimulates vigorous upright new growth. This upright new growth is very thin, very weak-wooded, because it's so vigorous. Its cells are very long and very elongated, and not quite as doesn't have the same structural integrity as a short cell will have. And also it develops these new buds, new vigorous buds, attached and very poorly anchored type of growth attachment. So what happens over time is that you begin to experience failures. So in large trees, um, this is detrimental. And in this example, this is actually a mature walnut tree that they topped in the south side some years ago. It eventually did die, and ended up going into that yard waste dumpster that's just below it, more figuratively. So it ended up dying. So this is very bad for mature trees. The reason it's so bad for mature trees is that it subjects the tree to rot and weak attached stems that fail over a period of time because of that long, vigorous new growth. In this illustration, in this slide, what you're seeing is a silver maple. There was a whole row of them that was along a street in the south side. The topping that they experienced really never had anything to do with the transformer in the back, which I'll probably talk a little bit about in a minute. But if you can see at that point where all those branches come together, there is a hole. That's a rotten spot because the heading cut that was made exposed a large area of the heartwood, which was not able to, and that wound was not able to close itself off. So you got a an area of rot that began to develop and started to move down into the main trunk of the tree. Also, what began to happen is you got um, a huge mass of new buds that began that broke and started to grow and began to develop in the stems. Now these are the outside of the main trunk. It's not strongly attached like a branch that developed with the trunk as it grew. So these are very vigorous and very weak wooded. So I'm sure at some point in time they began to break and cause issue with the surrounding landscape and other houses in the houses and the trees. So they came back and they topped it again. As you can see, there's a just above the original hole in the trunk, you'll see some cuts that were made. Again, heading cuts that um, cause this tree that will cause another rotten spot in that stem, and also long, vigorous, poorly attached stems to develop. So this is the one of the um, main issues with topping trees is that the the product that was sold of trying to make this tree safe was actually um, uh, caused this tree, weaken this tree, and ultimately made this tree more dangerous and ultimately had to be removed. So topping trees can be bad because it causes rot and poorly attached stems that have tendency to break off. Now, I mentioned that transformer earlier. I know I hear a lot of people remark about UE and how poorly that they prune trees, and um, I will I agree with that too, but I have to also, on the other hand, say that their priority is a lot different than what my priority would be as far as pruning trees. Their priority is as a public service, and that's to keep the power on to your house and to all the appliances that you have in your house. So, although that I don't agree with a lot of their pruning practices, I do agree that they have to prune in order to provide the service and keep the power on for um, during storms. So that being said, I think they can do a better job, but I think that their priority is just a little bit different than mine. So here's a tree that actually this tree was in the easement, the city easement, and it was across the street from me. As you can see, it's a sweet gum tree. This is a tree that the owner of the home did not like this tree for obvious reasons. Many people who have sweet gum trees above sidewalks don't like them. So one day he decided he was gonna cut this tree down. So in order to make this easier, he decided he was going to just take all the branches off. So what that entailed is basically top the tree in order to get all the branches off so he could stuff them all into a yard waste dumpster. So my immediate neighbor, she not with the neighbor with the roses, but another neighbor, actually called the police on this gentleman, and the police came and said to cease and desist because it was in the city easement, it's a city tree. So he stopped cutting this tree down, and what happened is over the next 2 years, it actually began to grow out. It put on a lot of adventitious buds at the cut ends and was very vigorous and very fruitful, actually. So in essence, he invigorated the tree. And so what happened is the tree put on a heavy fruit load on that weak and poorly attached wood, and it began to just snap in storms, started to break apart. So eventually, my neighbor, this gentleman that owned this tree, he moved away. Well, not because of the tree, but because he got transferred. But it's a good reason to move anyway. What he did to this tree. So, the moral of the story is don't top city trees unless you want to pay the price, especially a sweet gum. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and talk about tools. We okay with continue on with this? 7 now, so I've got about an hour and 5 minutes to go through the rest of this. So I'm just going to forge ahead and talk a little bit about the tools and how to use them. Unless Mark, you think is there any questions that I can answer at this time?
No, we're good now. I'd say just keep going.
All right, sounds good. Um, Normally, it's easy enough on these types of classes where people are kind of more comfortable in their homes watching it. So, so all right, let's talk a little bit about the tools that are used in pruning. You'll see talk about I'll mention hand pruners and loppers, saws, pruning saws, and extension saws and pruners. Um, the best hand pruners that you should be using are bypass type pruners. These are types of pruners that cut like a scissor like action where the blade bypasses an anvil. There are out on the market anvil type pruners. Those are the type of pruners that have a blade and a soft metal anvil, and the um, blade is forced through the whatever it is that you're trying to cut and onto this soft metal anvil. Um, I don't know why they still sell them, but they do. But I find that with those types of pruners, the flat metal anvil, uh, will crush the tissue that's underneath on the bottom side of that branch. When it crushes the tissue, it will not, it will create an area that will not uh, close itself off as well. It won't callus as well. It won't develop wound wood as well when you use that type of pruner. That's why the pruner that I always recommend is a bypass type pruner. So bypass type pruners that we issue to all our garden staff are Felco pruners. These are pretty widely available. You can find them online, obviously, anywhere. We get them from A.M. Leonard's. That's one of the horticultural supply companies that you can find a lot of different tools, pruners, hand saws, rakes, all kinds of hand tools. But anyway, we use Felco pruners because all the parts are replaceable, even down to the little spring washer that keeps that locking mechanism from swinging back and forth. So all those parts are replaceable, and they come in a lot of different sizes for a lot of different hand sizes. That's the nice thing about Felco pruners is that they are designed so that people with different hand sizes, smaller hand sizes, larger hand sizes, can find a comfortable pair of pruners to use. The number twos that we issue to all of our staff are for people that have a large hand and have good hand finger spread so that they can open the pruner more fully. Some of the other pruners that Felco has is for a small hand, so that you don't end up so you don't have to open your hand, your fingers as fully to open the pruner as fully. Okay, if you look at a a the card that comes on the back of the cell pack, it will have in the, I think, the upper right hand corner, it'll have an icon of a hand, and it will say either a large hand or a small hand. So those type of the pruner that would best be suited for your hand size. What that does is it just reduces fatigue and stretching of the tendons on for those who have a smaller hand whenever they're using a number two printer that's designed for someone with a larger hand and a longer finger spread. So Felco printers are um, probably one of the best pruners that you can get. Other ones that are out there that may not be as pricey would be like Fisker pruners, Corona pruners are also good pruners to have good bypass type pruners that you have. Bypass type pruners will cut to about a half inch, and that really depends on your own hand strength and also the type of plant that you're pruning and whether or not the tissue that you're pruning is alive or dead. So it's a little bit, green crabapple wood is a lot easier. A half inch green crabapple wood is a lot easier to prune through than a half inch dead crabapple wood. So it does make a huge difference as far as whether or not the tissue is alive or dead, as if how easily it is to prune through it with a hand pruner.
Hey Ben, we had one question, kind of relating to what you were talking about a minute ago. Can we take care of that before we get too far away?
Sure, absolutely.
So someone asked if there's ever a good reason to use a heading back cut.
um, it's good if you're doing like hedging work. You can um, sometimes you can rejuvenate mid-sized trees with heading back. I wouldn't go crazy doing that. I mean, you could probably do that with a red bud or maybe a Japanese maple or a crabapple. But the key to that is that you have to come back the following year or the second year after and correct those stubs that you created in a heading back situation. So you would do it to a crabapple, redbud, dogwood, Japanese maple, something like that, because it's had gotten so far out of its limits that you had to aggressively prune it. So you could prune it aggressively. You can make some heading cuts, but you'll have to correct those heading cuts as the plant recovers and puts on some additional growth, and you have it gives you opportunities like laterals that have gotten larger in size, gives you an opportunity to prune to it.
All right, thanks. I think that takes care of it.
Okay, does that answer that question adequately?
Yeah, it sounds like
Okay,
it.
okay.
Thanks, man.
All right. Talk a little bit about loppers. These are cut also on the bypass. I'm not big on pruning with loppers because it's hard to position them well in order to make a good cut. One of the reasons being is that you have to negotiate the length of the handles in amongst the branches of the trees. Often you're not able to um, get good alignment because of that, and also you're having to balance against the weight of the pruner against trying to make that alignment in the tree. If you do have to get a lopper to prune with, I suggest getting one that has some shorter handles, like 18-inch type. That's actually the type of pruner that's the top one that you see in the slide. It's the Corona type. Um, it's got, I think, 18-inch handles, and it has a good set of bumpers. That's the other thing that you would want to, um, I guess, test drive, try out, is if you are pruning and you bring the handles together. forcefully, that they're not getting banged together when you are reaching the end of that stroke, or yeah, at the end of that stroke, and that you have these rubber bumpers in order to absorb the shock of that. So certainly be sure that the handles, the length of the handles are far enough apart that by the time you make the blades, by the time the blades get through the cut, you're not racking your knuckles together with the handles. Typically, if I can hand prune it, I use my hand pruners to remove it. I'll actually move up to my hand saw, but loppers can prune up to about 3/4 of an inch in diameter of wood. And again, this is all will be dependent upon your own physical strength, also whether or not the material that you're pruning is alive or if it's dead. So you can use loppers. Typically, I'm using loppers just to dismantle pieces of branches that are already been removed and laying on the ground. So that's probably the greater use for me as far as pruning, or the use of loppers. Whenever you're pruning, I always try to encourage people that when they prune, is to never leave a stub, not even on the smallest piece of branch that you're pruning, because what that does is it makes it it makes it natural. It makes it the um, uh, the common practice. It's like something that comes naturally when you do when you prune, to leave no stubs, even down to the smallest cut that you make. Then it becomes natural that you won't do it as the cuts become larger. You won't leave a stub anywhere that you prune. um, Stubs are sort of just a little bit distracting. I get a little obsessed with them. Like if I'd go and I prune something that I haven't pruned before, or I'm trying to uh, uh, prune something that had been that was maybe uh, been pruned but pruned poorly. If I see a stub, I will actually I'll just seek them out and remove them. That's how obsessed I can get with them. I did a pruning demonstration, and I was pruning a plant. I was just pruning off the smallest stubs because it's just sort of become second nature for me to prune and not leave a stub. The reason that you want to try to avoid leaving stubs is that the stub will, over a period of time, will die, and it will die back to the healthy tissue, and will. There's a possibility that that piece can rot and start to move down into the healthy tissue, compromising its health and also its strength. So I always try to prune and not leave a stub. In pruning with using hand pruners that cut on the bypass, hand pruners or loppers that cut on the bypass, the best way to prune in order to not leave a stub is to make sure your pruners are oriented so that the bevel of the blade, if you look at the bevel of any bypass type, there's a flat side that bypasses the anvil, and the opposite side of that is a beveled side. So when you want to orient your pruner or your lopper, your bypass type pruner lopper, if you have it oriented properly to avoid leaving a stub, you will orient it with the bevel of the blade against the part of the plant that you want to keep. Okay, so if you flip it over where the anvil is against the part of the plant that you want to keep, you are going to leave a stub as long as the anvil is wide, however far you inserted the pruner anvil into the cut. So in order to get the best cut, you want to make sure that the blade of your pruner the bevel of the blade is oriented to the part of the plant that you want to keep. That way you'll get the best cut without leaving a stub. So I mentioned that if I am unable to cut through a piece of branch or a piece of wood with my hand pruner, I'll usually go to my saw rather than to use a set of loppers. Saws come in a lot of different configurations. These are the three bottom ones are all folding saws. Bottom one is a Felco. These are actually older types of pruning saws on the bottom two. Bottom one is a Felco type, takes 2 hands to actually lock and unlock. Also, that white handle one is a one that it's a silky saw, but it takes 2 hands to operate it. And the black handle one, that's the silky gomboy. That's the one that we most horticulturists are using at the garden. This is about a 7-inch blade. It's actually 210 millimeters, so it was about 7 point something inches. So that's the length of that blade, and it locks and with a one motion, you open it up, it locks into place. You push the button that's on the top, that unlocks it, and you can store it away into your pocket or to your sheath, or which I recommend to any of you that are going to be out there pruning on a regular basis, is to, if you make the investment in getting a good hand pruner and also a good pruning saw, I would recommend getting a sheath that you can put on your belt to house your tools in as you're working. Makes it convenient for when you need them as you're working in the garden, and it also keeps them safe, keeps them from being laid on the ground or placed in a wheelbarrow and tossed into the compost or into the yard waste bag or wherever it ends up going. So I would always try to I would always recommend that people get a sheath for their handsaw and for their pruner. Handsaws also come in fixed lengths. This is the top one is a handsaw that I used to use long ago when I was still working, still climbing trees for a living. So that's a bigger, more durable saw. Most of the saws in the industry these days are manufactured by Silky, Silky. That's a brand of handsaw. They have a lot of different sizes, a lot of different types of hand saws, a lot of folding saws, a lot of fixed length saws. So if you're interested in a good handsaw, I would recommend that. Felco makes a good pruning saw. Also, Corona also has a pruning saw too. One of the common characteristic of a good pruning saw is that it will cut on the pull stroke. It doesn't cut on the push, cuts on the pull stroke. That way you can take advantage of the blade length, and also to kind of put your body into the action of pruning. Pull cut cuts on the pull stroke, push cut cleans the kerf out, drops the sawdust out. So no, very little pressure is necessary on the push stroke. That actually, if you put too much pressure on the push stroke, that's what causes the blade to snap or to break. Chainsaws, not going to talk too much about that, only is to say that if you do have to use a chainsaw, just make sure you follow all the safety guidelines and have all the necessary personal protective equipment, the PPE. No flip flops, no shorts. So just be careful and safe in using if you have to use a chainsaw. If you do have to use a saw of any sort to remove a branch, you should do so using what's called the 3-cut method. What the 3-cut method does is it helps to take off the weight of that branch and also the length of the branch. And what that does is it prevents that tissue just behind and underneath on the bottom side of the cut, protects it from being torn and creating a poor wound that will not close itself off as well. So you can protect that and preserve that tissue by doing a 3-cut method removal. So you make a bottom cut, the number 1 cut, and what that is about 10, 12 inches from the trunk. You're going to make it about a quarter, maybe a third of the way into the branch before the weight actually pinches your saw. You'll learn that through some experience over time. So you'll make that bottom cut, you'll remove the saw, you'll come up to the top, you'll go forward or just above the bottom cut, and you'll make a cut through. And what that will do is it will remove the length, eliminating the weight, and so that you can make a final cut at the trunk. So that the final cut, the number 3 cut, is the final cut, and it is placed just before the branch bark ridge and the branch collar. And I'm going to talk about that probably in depth in just a minute. So that final cut at number 3 is just forward of the branch bark ridge and the branch collar. Um, you should not try to skip a step, save a step by trying to make your undercut back at what would be cut number 3 and try to match it from the top with the top cut. In all the years that I've been pruning, I've never been able to make a good match. You never get a good match between the bottom cut and the top cut. So it'll leave an uneven wound. So, you always want to try to do the best for the tree. Always try to make the best cut that you can possibly make. And the best cut that you can possibly make, it would be a single cut through at at point number 3. As you're cutting through, you're finishing up that cut, you want to support that stub of wood that's left, that 10, 12 inch of wood. Hold that in your hand, grasp it so it doesn't hinge over, doesn't lay over and create a tear on the bottom side of that cut. Okay. So I mentioned branch collar and branch bark ridge. What the branch collar is a zone. It's an area where two tissues come together. Because of the doubling of that tissue, it forms obvious structures on the exterior of the branch. One of them being the branch bark ridge and the branch collar. So the two tissues that come together are the branch tissue. That's what's initiated first in the cycle of that growth. You're gonna get branch tissue development. That tissue doesn't end at the trunk of the tree. It actually moves downward. You see a little bit of a teardrop or a inverted teardrop formation of that branch tissue as it moves down the trunk. Once that has completed its growth, the trunk begins its growth and develops tissue that actually envelops that branch tissue. So the trunk tissue envelops the branch tissue. So that's why when you have a branch that has grown with the tree since the very beginning, you'll see see why it's so well anchored and attached, and why buds and branches that develop after a tree has been topped or headed back is so poorly attached. It's because it's on the outside. It's not been enveloped by the trunk tissue fully. So it's going to be prone to breakage. So at that zone where the branch tissue and the trunk tissue merge is a zone that is called the collar. Now this collar, interestingly enough, is that when this is wounded, when you cut that branch off just before the branch bark ridge and the branch collar, that zone is induced to develop what is called the callus. The callus is a layer of cells that's very fast growing. And what that does is once those develop that callus, very thin layer, what then happens is the tree begins to develop what's called wound wood. Wound wood is what you'll see develop around stubs and or cuts made on the trunk. I'll show you some photographs of that in a minute. So that zone is what is going to eventually close off that wound to air and also prevent insect and diseases, provided that cut was made. It's not too large. So that's why you should always prune early. Prune while smaller the cut, the better, because it will close itself off much better than a large wound. Most recommendations are given that you wouldn't want to remove a branch more than 4 inches in diameter if you don't have to. So that's why you would want to prune early, prune young while the tree's developing. So on hardwoods, the area that you're trying to prune to is called the branch collar. So it's going to be, you'll see a branch bark ridge and a branch collar, which is a little bit of a swollen area on the bottom. Remember, there's an additional layering of tissues at that point. So there'll be a little bit of a bulge on the bottom side of that branch. And some species of trees, it's more apparent than others. This is a red maple, and you'll see the branch bark ridge. That's pretty apparent. It's on the top side, forms a very dark, rough ridge. And then on the bottom, you can see there's a little bit of a swelling on the bottom side of the branch. Um, Often, if it's not real apparent, you're actually going to have to run your hand down the underside of that union, that attachment point, to see if you can actually feel the collar underneath. So you're going to make your cut just forward of the branch bark ridge and the branch collar. It's on hardwoods. On conifers, this is you'll see there's the branch bark ridge, pretty apparent in most conifers, and you're going to see some concentric rings underneath that on the bottom side. That's the branch collar. Okay. Photographs here, the white pines, so the branch bark ridge, and then you can see as you take a closer look at it, there's some lines of rings that are developing just on the other side of that where that branch is emerging. So that's the branch bark collar. In most situations, if the cut is well placed, you're going to get symmetrical development of wound wood around that cut. It's going to be symmetrical, and it's also going to be consistent in width all the way around the wood, all the way around the wound. So here's a illustration of a slide where the cut was made a little bit too close to the branch bark ridge. You can see at the top of the wound, the wound wood that's developing is very thin, definitely not even near the size of the wound wood developing on the sides of the branch and even on the bottom. So that's not to say that this is not going to close itself off. It will eventually, but it just we can speed the process if we make sure that the cut that we make is well placed and is in front of the branch bark ridge and not going to be too far in and not too far out. So this takes practice. It takes observation of the things that you're pruning to give you an idea in the response of the tree, and it gives you an idea of how you need to adjust the placement of your saw, of your pruners. Okay, this is a wound that was made, a cut that was made, a branch that was removed, and it was well placed. The cut was well placed, and you see consistent, symmetrical development of wound wood around the cut, and the cut has actually closed itself off from the outside. In another probably a year or two, this will not be apparent at all. The tissue will mature, it'll differentiate, and it'll become furrowed, just as the surrounding bark is. Just another example of not leaving a stub. Why you wouldn't want to leave a stub. So you get a stub left, and the left of the illustration, stub was left behind. That decay moves down into the stem, compromising the structural integrity of that stem and also the support necessary for the stem above it. So you can see to the right, the illustration on the right, you see a well-placed cut made, and that closes itself off. Structural, the strength and integrity of that stem just below the remaining stem is sound, and you'll be able to get good closure and maintain good strength in that attachment. Just quickly to show a little bit more about what the tree does when it's made, when it's growing. On the left of that illustration, you can see where a stub was left, and the tree actually did try to close itself off. You can see the tissue starting to develop just on the outside of it. But what it's doing is it's turning in on itself and it's developing into a classic structure called ram's horning. Ram's horning really doesn't ever fuse well with the heartwood of the tree, and it will always be a little bit of a cavity. The rot that is developed because of the stub that's left behind actually moves down and up. It doesn't just confine itself to the place where the stub was left and downward. It actually moves up and down. Let me go back to that one just real quickly. On the right side of that illustration, you can see where a branch was pruned off at the proper placement in front of the branch bark ridge and branch collar, and the tree is actually starting to fuse. The wound wood is developing at a right angle to the wound, the cut that was made, and that will actually begin to fuse, and that will close itself off over time.
Hey, Ben, can we pause for a couple questions real quick?
Sure, absolutely.
So someone asked about wound sealer and if there's ever legitimate use for that.
Yeah, actually, there is a legitimate use for it now. It's actually a little bit of a resurgence in its use. Typically, the recommendation would be to not use a wound sealer, because it is a place where you can provide shelter for insects and places for perhaps diseases to develop. But in the case of, if you have to prune oaks after March and up until like August, during that period where oak beetle and oak wilt is going to be an issue, that would be a time that would be an appropriate time to use a wound sealer.
I actually used it for the first time in my life 2 Aprils ago on an oak for the exact same reason.
Mm-hmm.
So someone asked also, so they had a couple pin oaks they had pruned 10 years ago. And they said just last summer they both began weeping and leaking sap. And they said that they've heard different explanations as to why this is.
So where is that coming from? Is it coming from a wound on the trunk, or is it from the base, or where's it
Yeah, they
actually?
don't specify. Who is this here? Deanna Bates. If you maybe specify where exactly those, if they're coming from the wounds, that's not as mysterious. From where the branch was removed, yes.
So it's coming from the branch itself, or not from the wound?
From where it was removed, so the wound.
Oh, yeah, that's a hard diagnosis without really seeing it. I mean, the only thing I can think is that maybe the wound was not closing itself off very well. But that's one that I don't have an answer for right now.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there are, they said they had two different explanations. I think there are various reasons why that could have happened. So,
Sure.
someone else also asked if you could just show the slide with the branch bark ridge again.
Sure. Let's see. Let's see. I'm not exactly sure which one that was. It could be this one right here. Is that the one?
Yeah, I would think so. Yeah, I think they just kind of wanted to get an idea of where you make that final cut. And yeah, I mean, like you were saying, it varies a lot from species to species, and it's something you just kind of have to learn by pruning and observing and looking at old wounds on trees and observing your own work over seasons. So
Right. I think that's going to be the best way to train yourself to make a proper cut, is just to make some cuts and observe how the plant responds to it, and you can make corrections to the placement of your cut going forward.
all right, that's it for now. Thanks.
All right. Let's see, where was I? Okay. Just talk quickly about extension saws and pruners. Anything that you use that extends your reach can be useful. Just got to be careful if you're doing it. Best to always do it from the ground if you can. Those aluminum handled ones, those are manufactured by ARS, and they cut on the bypass as well. There's a lot of different links, fixed links. There's some telescopic links. So if you're looking for them, you can look for them on at AM Leonard's. They sell the long reach ones, the ARS long reach pruners. The yellow handle ones is a pole saw. That head, that saw blade cuts on the pole stroke. So just like any good pruning saw will, you can extend your reach by probably 12 feet with a pole saw, pole pruner. Pole pruner is a type of that type of pole pruner is the one that cuts on a bypass as well. These are hard to. That's a little bit more difficult to use. A lot like loppers, where you have to take a little bit of practice to actually orient them and place them properly on a cut to make a good cut. Okay, let's see. Let's talk a little bit about shearing. So shearing is an important landscape practice. You know, it's important in landscapes where you may have topiaries. It's a formal garden. You have geometric forms that you want to try to maintain. The thing about shearing is that um, um, it's a heading back mostly when you're pruning it. So you're ending up over time doing a practice that most people would consider sort of a reductive practice, that you're making it smaller. But in fact, over a period of time, what happens is that when you prune and you are unable to prune through the mass and the density of the stems, you actually raise your shears higher. You move them up into a density of tissue, stem diameter that you're going to be able to shear through easily. So, you know, you may raise your pruners up a quarter inch or a half inch or an inch even in order for you to continue to shear through. So even though you are removing terminals, you're reducing the size of the plant. It's also it is in fact over time is actually increasing the size of the plant through the shearing that you're doing. So in order the best thing to do if you do have to shear to maintain a particular landscape form or particular landscape intent, you should follow up either every time you shear or every 2 or 3 years go back in and actually do some drop crotch pruning, some really large stem reductive type prunings to open up the crown, reduce the stubbiness, reduce density, and allow for new growth to begin to develop from on the interior. So hand shearing is okay, but you got to make sure that you are coupling that with some hand pruning every 2 or 3 years in order to reduce the density and maintain an open crown. So, like I said, when you shear on a continual basis, what happens is the stems begin to develop more in number. They get larger in diameter, and they begin to create a very shallow dead zone that's very dense. And what that does is it cuts down on light penetrating to the interior of the crown, and also good air circulation. What will eventually happen too is that you'll get a lot of detritus, you get a lot of leaves and debris that will collect on the interior of the stems because it's so dense. And that's just a good place for insects to be harbored, and also a good situation for diseases to develop as well. So it's always good that you do a little bit of reduction pruning, hand pruning, in order to reduce that. So here's a situation where, um, yeah, local drive-through, as you can see, where this plant is actually Mirica planted along the side. Interesting plant choice, but anyway, you can see over a period of time where this plant has been just constantly sheared to keep it back away from the driving lane, but not so much that it didn't start to push out and away because the stems got too large. I just went back there recently and they did a really terrible job of just butchering this in order to give the clearance that they needed. And I'll have to include that in my next slideshow. But you can see they probably could have taken the time, did some hand pruning over the course of the years to take out some of the larger, more dense areas, and then been able to shear to maintain the this plant within the limit of the curb. So to if you do have a shrub that's been sheared for a long time, a plant that's been sheared for a number of years, you can see that you can actually unshear the shrub. It may take you 2 to 3 years in order to do it, but the first year you want to do is you want to take out a lot of that high that density of that sheared area, open it up, allow for a little bit more light, a little bit more air to circulate. Light penetrating will allow for new growth to begin to develop on the interior, which will allow the opportunity for you to prune back to that the second year, third year. Likewise, you can do the same. You can prune to new stems, new growth developed on the inside until you've recaptured the density and the form of the plant, reduce some of the rigid areas and some of the dense areas that don't ever develop well anyway as far as leaf structure and color. Often when you do this kind of work on shearing a shrub, one of the good ways to find an area that is way too dense and way too heavy is to just run your hand over the top of the shrub. And your hand meets resistance, that's an area that you need to probably address in as far as taking some making some larger cuts, opening them up, doing some drop crotch pruning in order to reduce the density and reduce the size. If you're shearing to maintain a shrub in the landscape or a hedge in the landscape, you always want to prune so that the bottom of the hedge is going to be narrower than the top, an inverted taper. You want to do this in order to prevent the lower part of the plant from shading out the lower the the upper part of the plant from shading out the lower part. If you were to allow the upper part of the plant to become wider than the lower part, that could potentially happen is that you could get the upper part so wide that it's shading out the lower part.
Hey, Ben.
Yes.
Someone just asked if all shrubs have a dead zone that should not be cut into.
Well, the dead zone is created by the fact that the outside is too dense. So you can um, open it up to expose that dead zone to a little bit more light, and that will help to encourage some new growth to develop. But you can cut into that zone if you have to. I mean, um, you have to kind of assess the plant, see how far you can actually prune to reduce it to a lateral that's still green. So, you don't go in there and just head it back. You want to do a good drop crotch cut to a lateral. So you have to just examine the plant itself, see how much you want to reduce, follow that branch, that live branch to the interior to a lateral that's at about the approximate size that you want to maintain and prune it off at that point. And you would do that all within a given area. And I'll talk a little bit about that when I talk about shaping and pruning of plant material.
Great, thanks.
So you see pruning bases. This is actually a process of pruning where you're going to look at each of these structures on a plant, prune them. You may end up walking around a plant 7 or 8 times because you're going to address these as individuals. Once you sort of mastered that, you kind of see how the pruning develops, see how the plant recovers, see how you make your adjustments to that recovery. You'll be able to sort of combine all these steps into what would be more of a technique, a pruning technique, where you start in at point A, walk around the plant. When you return to that starting point, you're finished. The only thing you have to do is clean up. So hopefully over time, with practice and observation, you'll be able to improve proficiency, and then later on your efficiency as you develop that proficiency. So these are the things that I'll talk about going through and we'll address as individuals. So first thing to talk about are that you would want to remove when you're pruning is to remove what I call the 3 Ds: dead, dying, and disease. So as I mentioned earlier, pruning for health benefits is an important part of pruning. So removing diseased parts, that would be the first thing that you would want to one of the first things that you would want to remove. You would take out anything that might be dying or anything that might be dead. All those things lead to issues with disease and or insects, and potentially in the future. You will also be surprised that just by removing any of the dead, dying, or diseased plants parts, how it actually opens up the crown of the plant. So it's always a good place to start if you're new to pruning or reluctant to prune. Those are the first things that you would want to prune out and remove. And once you do that, you'll be pleasantly surprised at the outcome. Next thing that you would want to remove are water sprouts. Water sprouts are those structures that are very vigorous in their growth and very vertical in their habit. And over time, they can actually take over the parent plant. So these are characterized um, their vertical nature, and also uh, the vigor at which they grow. So you would want to remove these at their point of origin, either on the trunk, or oftentimes they'll develop along the lateral branches, along the scaffolds. Some trees, some species are this is inherent in their growth habit. So it's just a matter of being aware of that and removing them as they're small, rather than allowing them to get larger than they need to be, and where you're having to make a larger cut than's necessary. Root suckers, next things that you would want to remove. Again, some trees are it's inherent in their habit, their growth habit, to have root suckers. So you would want to remove them and as close to the ground as possible. Or if you can gently excavate around that root sucker to find its point of origin, you can prune it off at the root. Those actions will slow them down, but like I said, if it's inherent in the growth habit of the tree, really the best thing that you can do is just to stay on top of it so that they don't overtake the parent tree.
Hey, Ben,
Vertical, yes.
sorry, we just had a real quick question about someone was talking about having I assume a devil's walking stick and a magnolia that they get a lot of water sprouts at the bottom of that just always come back, and they asked if there's a better way to discourage those rather than just pruning them off.
Pruning them off is about the best way that you can uh, take care of them, or get rid of them. There's really not much you can do with magnolias. I mean, they're going to develop water sprouts and they're going to be developing root suckers. So I think that the best thing to do is, if you can stay on top of it, that's the best way to keep them away. I think that once you do that, if you do that consistently, I think over time they'll produce fewer going in the future.
Thanks.
So okay, so we're taking off the root suckers. Then we'll take a look at narrow crotches. If there's a see if there's any that exist within the tree. In some species of tree, narrow crotches is inherent to their growth habit. You'll see that all around town over the recent years, as the pears that are very narrow in their growth habit start to dismantle and break apart because of that narrow crotch situation. What happens in the narrow crotch situation is that you have stems that are so close together that they're actively growing and they're beginning to push against each other, and then you sort of couple that with some external forces like wind or rain or snow, and it puts pressure on one or both or all the branches, causing it to split apart. This common that you'll see around city and county of the pears that were planted probably 30 years ago now. So they're starting to break apart. Um, if you do have a plant that is in its growth habit, it's naturally develops a narrow crotch angle, you should be prepared to either prune it so that you get good crotch angle, somewhere between 30 and 70 degrees, or use spreaders, like spreaders, to help push the stems apart as they're growing, so that you get a good branch attachment, rather than something that's too close that is going to fail as the tree begins to grow. So
Hey,
as you
Ben, someone asked for that three stem narrow crotch example. They asked what you would prune.
well, if it was young enough, I would try to take that center one out. Some situations you might not be able to, because it's so the crotch is so tight. Um, they do make these hand operated chainsaws. It's like a cable with teeth on it that you could possibly slip down in there if the space will allow, and that'll give you a tool that you can use to take that center one out. But if you address this when it's young, it will. won't be as catastrophic, or won't be as traumatic to the tree to try to grow around it and close it off.
Thanks.
So once we've gotten past the narrow crotches, then we're going to start to look for branches that are either crossing or rubbing. So these are typically branches that are growing back and into the canopy of the tree and growing across other ones. Normally, when you're typically when you're trying to prune the canopy of a tree or even a shrub for that matter, they should all the branches should all radiate out as if they were your fingers outspread, so that the your center fingers are pointing straight up. The side index and small finger are pointing outward, and the thumb is pointing outward. So it should all radiate outward from the center. So if you have a branch that's beginning to grow backwards and into the structure of the tree, you could set yourself up, or the tree could be set up to have a rubbing branch or a crossing branch situation develop. What can happen over time is that through wind action and movement, if those two pieces begin to continue to rub together, you could get some girdled areas where where the cambium's destroyed, either on one or both of the stems. You can get a little bit of grafting on some species of trees that have soft bark. They can graft together at that point, and can be much more difficult to address. If you do have a situation where the branches have grafted together, what I normally recommend is taking off the end of the branch that's doing the crossing. Make another cut just on the opposite side of the branch that is grafted to, that severs the connection between the two branches, and then remove the rest of the branch that had been previously grafted onto the opposite onto the other branch, to the one. So that's the remainder of the branch that's growing inward and towards and creating a crossing branch situation. So you're going to remove that completely. The piece of wood that's left behind, the grafted piece, if it's not huge, I would just leave that on there, because what'll happen is that small piece of wood is going to dry and it's going to shrink. And the part of the tree that's still alive is going to grow and put on new tissue. And just through those opposing actions, it's going to actually push that piece of wood off. So it'll remove that piece of wood on its own. If you try to remove it while the two pieces are still green, while the one that is crossed over and grafted is still green, you will actually it will tear the tissue of the branch that you want to retain. So it's always best to just leave that little piece on there, wood on there, let it dry up and shrink, allow the other tree to grow and expand, and allow that small piece of dead wood naturally separate from the tree itself. Competing branches. So this is a situation where you might have a branch that is growing one over the top of the other, where the lower branch is being shaded out by the upper one. So this illustration would suggest that you would take that lower branch off. What I would suggest is that you see which branch is going to have the least negative impact on the overall density of the tree, overall symmetry of the tree. So it doesn't necessarily have to be that bottom branch. It could be the top branch, the branch growing above it, that could be removed because it's having the least negative impact through its removal. Okay. Developing good vertical spacing. So this is arranging the scaffold branches so they have good spacing, for good space in which they can develop for the future. So basic rule of thumb is that you want to allow for 18 to 36 inches between branches for trees that are greater than 40 foot at maturity. So that gives you good spacing, good vertical spacing, allowing each branch to develop fully as the tree reaches maturity. And then you want to develop good radial spacing. That's so that you can prune, and as you are either drone's eye view or from looking up from below, you want to see that you have branches that are well arranged around the circumference of the trunk in a spoke-like fashion so that the branches all have adequate room to develop and to receive sunlight. So in a situation where you're trying to shape a tree or shape a shrub or shape anything, you always want to start at the top of the plant when you're pruning. If you take too much, if you start on the side, you take too much out in order to compensate and be sure that you have a rounded form or a symmetrical form. You're going to have to take out much more from the top, so that will potentially create a hole. Usually, what I recommend is that if you're pruning a shrub or even a tree for that matter, you start at the top and you imagine that this plant has a grid overlaid over the crown, and this grid is measured off in 1 foot by 1 foot increments. So you want to start in the first very top center increment, 1 foot grid section, and you want to reduce it. You want to make your drop crotch cut. That's going to be your largest cut. You want to follow it to the inside to a branch to a lateral that's at the size, at the approximate size at which you want to reduce that plant to or maintain that plant at. Okay, and ending with prepositions, so not always good, but you want to. So you want to take that longest piece, follow it to the interior, make a drop crotch cut to a lateral that's at the approximate height that you want to maintain the plant. That's going to be your largest cut. You're going to do that several times, probably within that 1 foot grid until you get close to where you want to be. Next cuts that you're going to make are going to be more intermediate cuts. That's to help to balance the density of the plant so that you have good openings throughout that 1 foot grid by making intermediate cuts. So you make these intermediate cuts to address the density of the plant. So you're making some drop crotch cuts. You're going to make some thinning cuts to open it up a little bit more. Finally, you're going to get to the point where you're going to make the smallest cuts. Those are either your tip cuts or the cuts that you're gonna maybe shear off if you're using a shearing. So you're gonna maybe take off maybe up to about an inch or so to shear it off to give consistent to tighten the form consistent and give it consistent appearance throughout. So you don't have to do that step. You can do it by doing tip pruning with your hand pruner. So once you've completed that 1 foot grid section, you're going to move down the side, another 1 foot grid, move down the side, another 1 foot grid. You're going to do that until you go all the way down to the ground. So what you've done is you develop 2 points of reference, and you develop the top reference, and then you develop a side reference, and you're always going to return to that when you're pruning as you're moving around the plant. So once you've done the top, going all the way down to the ground, go back up to the top. You're going to go off of that and top and the side, and you're going to prune down the side again and 1 foot grid. You keep doing that until you get all the way around the plant, and then by the time you do that, you're pretty much done with the pruning shaping process. Okay, and you kind of have to practice that over time. If you do that in a very systematic way, if you approach that kind of pruning, if you approach the pruning in that sort of systematic fashion, you're going to have good success. You're going to have successful results because you approach it in a systematic way. If you approach it in a more random fashion where you're pruning a little here, pruning a little there, pruning around one side then the other side, if you're so indiscriminate and you're so random, you will be less than successful by the time when you're finished. It's going to take you probably longer to do because you won't have a focus, you won't have any points of reference, and it will be a little bit inconsistent in its shape and its density. So it's important that you sort of stay focused, be succinct, be systematic in your approach to it, and prune, always going back to those 2 reference points. Okay, lot to try to describe, without in this kind of format, but hopefully that makes sense. And you can always kind of refer back to the using the drop crotch and thinning cut illustration, how you start at the top and then move down the sides. Okay. So talk a little bit about specific types of plants. Deciduous plants it's pretty easy, not much to really that too jarring as far as type of pruning that you're going to do. But as far as conifers, there's a couple of different types of conifers that you'll have to prune, and will prune at some point in time. There's the whorl branching type of conifer. This is your spruces, your firs, your pines, those types of plants that develop in obviously in whorls. When pruning these types of conifers, you always want to prune back to either a whorl or a developing bud within that first year of growth. Once you get past the second year growth, the uh, the existence of buds begins to diminish. So that's why it's important that you cut back to either a whorl beyond that 2-year growth mark, or if you're within that 2-year growth mark, you could cut back um, indiscriminately along the stem. And if you want to if you're trying to do enhance density or try to develop the form a little bit more. So that's whorl type branching. So you can always know you can cut back to a whorl. You can always cut back to a bud as long as there is one that exists. Random branching conifers, these are your arborvitaes, your yews, your junipers. These are the types of conifers that you can prune back indiscriminately along the stem. And that's the reason that these plants are typically used for hedging situations, topiary situations, because they can tolerate the shearing and will have good recovery given if they're hand pruned on a regular basis in conjunction with the shearing. Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit about shrubs and the type of pruning that one can do to shrubs that we have in our landscape. You can either do annual pruning, renewal pruning, or rejuvenation pruning. Annual pruning is the type of pruning that one would do to eliminate large stems that may be out of balance to the overall form of the plant, or you may be taking out dead wood that has developed during the year or years past. So you're just pruning out making your larger cuts to try to bring the plant back into balance. Once you bring it back into balance, then you can start to make some thinning cuts to actually open it up, create a better balance density of the shrub throughout. So this is a type of pruning that one would do on an annual basis. Renewal pruning is a type of pruning that one would do to a type of plant that you're growing for its bark characteristic. This is true of like yellow twig dogwood, red twig dogwoods. There's a lot of different type of willows that have colorful bark. Barberry, most people don't think about barberry as far as colorful bark, but most people think about barberry for their leaves and for their thorns, of course. But the new stems of barberry, as they're emerging, is actually a very nice burgundy color if you're looking for that type of accent in your landscape. So the way that you could do that is just to make sure that you take out older stems, 2-year-old stems, 3-year-old stems on a regular basis. Same is true of like yellow twig dogwood, red twig dogwoods. You want to be able to on a regular basis take out 2-year-old and 3-year-old wood in order to encourage a new growth coming up from the roots that are more colorful, more vigorous in their habit. The way that you can determine the age of the stem is to look at the base of the stem, and what you'll see is the base of the stem is beginning to change in its color, and it's beginning to change in its texture. It's getting a little bit rougher in texture, and it's getting a little bit darker in coloration, turning into more of a sort of a brownish tan color as it emerges from the ground. This is an indication that that stem is somewhere around the 2 to 3 year old age range. And those are the stems that you would want to remove in order to encourage that new vibrant growth to come up from the roots. Rejuvenation pruning is a type of pruning where you're taking the shrub all the way to the ground. Not all shrubs will tolerate this and recover, and most shrubs will not recover from this if you do it at the wrong time of the year. If you are going to do rejuvenation pruning, this should be done during the dormant period or early in the spring, as the plants are breaking dormancy and beginning the cycle of growth. This is for plants that have gotten a little bit maybe overgrown, or have become a little bit too dense. You can do this to spirea. You could probably do this to forsythia if you had one that needed to be rejuvenated that was still rather vigorous. You could do this to forsythia. Do this to privet. You could do this to um, uh, hmm, some lilacs. You can do this too. So, you can look it up to determine whether or not that plant is going to tolerate that sort of pruning. Most references, if you get a good reference that's not that's like actually a book with paper, I would suggest one that has an encyclopedia that describes the plant type of pruning that it will tolerate, and also the time of the year that you can do it as well. But any type of pruning like this, rejuvenation pruning, something that you want to do in the dormant period or in the early spring. That's true of anything that you want to prune aggressively, to get it back into the space and back into its limits, is to do it in the springtime when it's just before it's beginning its cycle of growth. If you miss that cycle of growth and you wait too late into the year, into the summer, you'll more than likely cause some serious damage. You'll get a lot of dieback. You could potentially, if it's too aggressive, you could potentially kill the plant. So you want to make sure the timing is right, given the goal that you've set for the pruning that you're going to do. Timing is what season does prune certain trees or shrubs. I was told that you're going to prune whenever the pruner's sharp, which is probably true as good rule of thumb. You're always going to prune whenever it's sharp, but you're going to prune when it's best. The timing is best for you, whether you have the time to address it or not. Given your my position and in the position of the staff at the botanical garden, we prune whenever we can possibly prune, because you never know when other priorities will arise, and whether or not you'll lose time because the spring is so quickly advanced. It's hard to tell when spring is going to come, or summer for that matter. So we have to prune whenever we possibly can to be most effective. But if you have a summer blooming shrub, you want to prune those on current. They typically flower on current season growth, and you're going to prune those after the new growth starts. Okay, so that they'll develop the new growth. They'll develop the flower buds at the terminal, and they'll develop blooms later on in the summer. Spring blooming shrubs. These are the type of shrubs that flower in previous year's growth. So you're going to prune immediately after they flower, like forsythia and azaleas and rhododendrons. Those are going to flower next year on current year growth. So on the growth that was developed this year. So, and that is the end of my presentation. There is actually a few minutes left. If I can answer any questions, I'd happy to do it.
Yeah, Ben. So we had a question about what I think is maybe one of the most abused pruning practices I see out there, which is removal of lower branches, crown raising or limbing up or whatever you want to call it. Can you just address maybe the proper way to go about doing that?
Well, it kind of depends on what you want what the goal is for the for that plant in the landscape. Um, I'm gonna turn my video off. People can see me here. It depends on what you want that plant to do in the landscape. Doesn't necessarily. It's not critical that you remove the lower branches, but if you have a plant to you don't mind having it, those branches come all the way down to the ground. You just have to develop a bed around it, a mulched area that you can avoid any kind of damage with mechanical damage through mowing or whatever. So that's really up to you and how you want the plant to develop or how you want it to be seen in the landscape.
Yeah, I guess something I see a lot is, someone will just go and remove half of the all the branches off the bottom half of a tree all at once. So I think it's just important for for people to remember that you don't, you always want to stick to about 25%, and if you are going to remove those, do it system, don't just go up and knock them all out at once.
Right. I would agree with that. I think that it's important to do that over time, just so that it's not such a shock to the tree, and aesthetically it's not very, I don't consider that very good looking.
Yeah. Yeah, it looks like I don't see any other questions, so and we're just a little past 8:05, so okay, I'm sorry. I thought there was a question in there, but it was just someone making a comment. So yeah, well, thanks a lot, Ben. I really appreciate it.
Oh yeah, you're
Yeah,
welcome.
I think other than in-person instruction, that's about as thorough as you could really get with pruning. That pretty much covers all the bases. So yeah, thanks a
Yeah,
lot. Really
I hope
appreciate it.
everyone can that makes sense to everybody. And if they have questions later on, you can shoot me an email or something, or send it to Mark. And if you can, I'm sure Mark can probably answer as well as I can. If not, you can always send it my way, and I'll try to give you an answer. So, but I'm
Great.
happy to do it. Glad to share pruning and the passion for it. So,
Great. Well, thanks a lot. And thanks everyone. And happy St. Patrick's Day. I guess I forgot to mention that earlier. And we will see everyone next week, next Wednesday at 6 o'clock for our final session.
well, good luck everybody, and happy spring.
Yeah, thanks. Good night,
All
everybody.
right, see you later.